I think to sum up, I know you've had a lot of arguments and discussions about the EU and how, what the arguments that should be used. I just want to tell you very briefly about the role I'm playing in Brussels as the leader of the third largest group and how I'm helping David Cameron in the negotiations. And then I want to tell you a bit about my experience, what I've been doing going around London, but just giving talks about the referendum, about why we're having the referendum, what we're asking for, what we're not asking for. I know you know all that bit, but actually some of the arguments I'm hearing on both sides. So whichever side of the referendum campaign you end up on, and I gather where most of you will end up, I think it's important that we understand the arguments of both sides. It helps the robustness of your argument when it comes to that debate. And I'm doing this going around London, hoping to help people make up their mind. Because I'm sure you've heard the complaint. A lot of people say, I just don't know. I really don't know. I hear good arguments on both sides. And one of the things that Number 10 are very aware of is that if they look at the opinion polls, if you strip away all the sort of the spin on it from the Daily Express or from the Guardian or whatever, actually it comes down to about 33% have already decided they will stay, 33% have already decided they want to leave, and 33% are undecided. They're waiting for what the deal will be. And they're also, some of them will want to be loyal to the Prime Minister. Some of them will want to do the opposite of what the Prime Minister recommends. But the people are yet to make up their mind. And actually, I think the analogy I use is if someone came along and said to you, you went into a shop and the shop said to you, I've got this fantastic deal. I can't give you the details yet, but I'll give you the details in 2 months' time. You'll probably be like that 33% in the middle. You'll wait for the details of that deal before you actually made up your mind. I think that's a challenge that both camps will face. My role has been very simply to help grease the process, to make sure that Cameron's messages are getting through when Philip Hammond comes out, when George comes out less, but when those conversations, and to make sure they get through to the right people. So one of the things I'm doing is going talking to all the other group leaders, the EPP group leader, Socialist group leader, ALDE, and other groups, just to explain the referendum, why we're having it, some of the issues, and actually just to clarify. So for example, one of the issues that people weren't quite clear about was why were we asking for this ever closer union? Why was that important? And when you explain that, and you explain the fact that we're not trying to stop those countries who want to buy into ever closer union, we just don't think it should be a one-size-fits-all. It gets more sympathy, for example. Or the whole idea of the Eurozone, non-Eurozone. We're not going to necessarily stop those countries who want to have deeper integration in the Eurozone if they feel that's a solution to the Eurozone. We just don't necessarily have to be part of that. And when that is explained, people say, oh, actually, I hadn't realised that. I thought you were trying to impose a British vision on Europe rather than allow us to go our own way. And there are little things like, I'll give you an example. After the general election, Martin Schulz, the President of the Parliament, came up to me and he said, I sent David Cameron a thank you note and he hasn't replied to me. And that in itself is a message. I said, well, hold on, Martin. I'm pretty sure our Prime Minister had lots and lots of congratulations messages. He just probably hasn't got round to it. I mean, Martin, so you're probably not surprised that that's the sort of reaction. And he took it so personally. So I said, Martin, listen, okay, look, I'll have a word. So I got back to Number 10. I said, do me a favour. Will you just, find Martin's message and reply to it? And he replied, next week, I saw Martin Schulz again. He said, Syed, thank you very much. He said, the Prime Minister has invited me to Britain. I'm going next week. Thank you very much. And completely changed. The problem was, apparently, we then laid out a red card. He had a red carpet. He had tea with the Queen. He went to Westminster Abbey. And I said to the Prime Minister, what are you doing? I just said reply to the email. I didn't tell you to roll out the red carpet. But that kind of stuff, it's all politics. It all greases the wheels, reduces the misunderstanding. And I'm having a monthly meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker. We have a monthly meeting with Timmermans, the first Vice President of the Commission. And then I'm meeting Prime Ministers who happen to pop by. So it's quite nice to have Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, pop by in my office for a cup of tea and just talk about some of the issues. What are the arguments I'm hearing? And I'll quickly go through them, and I'm sure you've covered a lot of them today, and probably arguments on both sides. Clearly, from the Stay campaign, you're hearing arguments about trade. You're hearing arguments about, actually, if we leave, there's no certainty about what the trade agreements will be. And actually, what about the unravelling of the EU trade agreements? And what about those? What about the EU itself responding to the UK, trying to go around the world, sign trade agreements with some of the countries or regions it signed trade agreements with? The second argument I hear is, well, yes, even if we leave, we'd still have to pay something into the EU, the Norway option or whatever option, and we'd be paying money in. Yes, admittedly, it would probably be less than we pay in now, but we would have no say. So you're paying money, at least you're paying in now and you get something back, whereas you'd be paying in with no say. The third argument is the freedom of movement. It's all very well complaining about people from other EU countries coming to the UK, but actually there are as many Brits who exercise their right under freedom of movement in other EU countries. And there's no certainty as to what would happen to Brits abroad if we left. And also what would happen to those people already here. No one's actually said whether they'd be given grandfather rights, what sort of uncertainty it would cause for them, what about friends and family. And probably the fourth and the strongest argument I'm hearing from the Stay campaign, and one that I think the Leave campaign are struggling to argue against, is the uncertainty argument. Years ago, I did my PhD on organisational change in post-communist economies, because that's the sort of exciting person I am. What was fascinating about the change process and trying to explain the change process, when you've got societal change, political change, loss of legitimacy of the old regime, and then you've got companies that were former departments of state trying to become private, competitive companies. So setting up for the very first time an accounting department or set up a marketing department for the first time when they never had to do it, and stopping providing welfare to their staff. And actually it was all about wages and payments and remuneration based on performance. One of the biggest challenges in all that is uncertainty. And resistance comes from uncertainty because people are scared. It's personally unbalancing, it's very difficult, and people are just worried about the alternative and it hasn't been explained to them. And actually uncertainty is the strongest argument, I think, that the Stay campaign has got. And finally, one of the other arguments I hear about is constitutionally, in Britain, what happens if a majority of Scots vote to stay in, but a majority of Brits vote to leave? Would that not give the Sturgeon and others that remit to have another referendum, and could that be the breakup of the Union? And so that's, those are the arguments I had. I had the counter-argument that Scotland would then face the choice of a union with the EU or a union with the UK, and it's 80% of their trade is with the UK. But there's no certainty as to what the result of that referendum would be. Going back to the uncertainty. On the Leave campaign, the arguments I'm hearing from the Leave campaign is the cost. We're paying 13 billion or 10 billion after the rebate. Surely, even if we paid in less, we would still have that money could be spent on schools and hospitals or other things. The problem is there's no consensus on what that money will be spent on. It's a bit like if anyone remembers the sort of Beeching debate of railways being cut. I mean, some lines that were cut, the argument that was made was that, it's cheaper to pay everyone to go by taxi who uses this line than to keep that line open. There are 7 people who use this line a day, let's just pay for everyone to go use a taxi. The fact is, though, when those lines were cut, the authorities did not pay for people to use their taxi. So it's all very well theoretically saying if we left, we'd have all this money to spend, but there's no certainty as to how that money would be spent. Probably one of the strong arguments that I know, and that this resonates very strongly amongst immigrant communities, particularly immigrant communities from outside the EU, is what the Leave campaign called a fair immigration policy. Their argument is that actually in the EU we have a racist, discriminatory immigration policy where anyone can come from an EU country and walk in, and people from other countries, Commonwealth countries and others. So, and some of these people, their families gave their lives during the war, etc. They'll say, those people have to get visas or they're waiting for aunts and uncles to come in, whereas someone can come from another EU country that has no historical links, not France, Netherlands or Germany, countries that gave us royal families, but countries that we have no historical, those strong links with, and it is not an unfair policy. Surely if we left, we could set our own immigration policy and we could treat everyone equally, whether you're from Austria or Australia, Croatia or the Caribbean, India or Italy. That's fine, but will the Leave campaign agree, if we did leave, on that immigration policy? Or would there be challenges about no immigration, and what would happen once again to people already here? What about, would there be grandfather rights? So that's the uncertainty. The other arguments I hear is, well, actually it's all very well Cameron getting this ever closer unions phrase, but will we really stop political union? The ECJ and the Commission, they'll continue pushing on. So these arguments that you're going to have to challenge. Final two arguments I've been hearing are things like, well, loss of democracy. I think this is the old Tony Benn argument. If you don't like a government, you can vote for another government and change it. well, actually, what if we don't like an EU directive or regulation? Doesn't matter which government we vote for, which MEPs we vote for, we can't reverse that. And I think some of the ideas that we're hearing about and some of the ideas that the ECR are pushing for in terms of repealing legislation, refit legislation, could go some way to addressing those concerns. Some people are now saying, it's interesting, I had dinner with a journalist last night, an FT journalist who used to be a Lib Dem activist, very, very pro-European. He said, I'm very pro-European, but I'm annoyed about Europe. And I actually think that Europe will give us a second referendum. Every country that's voted no gets a second referendum. And there's this argument being put about. Now, George Osborne is trying to say, has been saying, this is it, there will be no second referendum. But there's an argument that's being put about, saying, yeah, but every other time that someone's voted no, there has been an offer of a second referendum. And that's an argument that has to be challenged. And finally, I hear the argument of people who are globalists. So don't forget, both campaigns, Leave and Stay, are coalitions. And there are people within the Leave campaign who say that Europe, they say, you talk about little Englanders, but we think they are little Europeans. The world is bigger than Europe. And just in the same way that my kids can go to France or Italy, actually, my kids want to be able to go to China or Singapore or America. There's a world bigger than Europe. So arguments on both sides, some pretty good arguments on both sides, some pretty rubbish arguments, if I'm honest, I've also heard on both sides. I've heard arguments that if we leave, we'll be like Hong Kong, or if we leave, we'll be like North Korea. Those two extremes. And I think what we need to do is get away from those extreme arguments and argue on reason. When I speak to most undecided, they will tell me it will be something that touches them personally that makes them move one way or the other. It might be the fact, for example, if they come from a family with a Commonwealth background, that the argument about what they call the fair immigration policy may make them decide to vote to stay. It may be because someone works for a company or does a lot of business in Europe or has European family that says, actually, I want to stay. And we mustn't underestimate that sort of personal issue and how you address those personal issues and tap into those personal issues. I'll just stop by explaining the two coalitions as I see them and why I think the Stay campaign has got the strength if it uses it. The Stay campaign is a range of views. They're both coalitions. The coalition of the Stay campaign ranges from people who do believe in the European project, but sadly don't feel brave enough or able to say that in Britain, that they have no objection to the United States of Europe or whatever. And I think it's sad that we have never had people do no longer have that sort of bravery if they feel that. I may not agree with them, but they should have that strength or conviction. Right through to people who say, you know what, I'm really fed up with Europe. My heart says leave, but my head says stay, because I'm scared of the alternative. That is the coalition of views, but their message is stay. And the coalition of Leave is far more varied, and this is why you're seeing disputes within the Leave campaign, and you're reading about them. The Leave campaign ranges from the left, the hard left, who see the EU as a liberal conspiracy. TTIP will undermine the NHS. It's really terrible. We want nationalisation of everything, and the EU stops us from doing that. Right through to what I call BNP Light or UKIP argument. We hate all immigrants, or we don't like immigration. If we leave, there won't be any immigration. Right through to sort of the globalists who say, I'd like to be able to leave so we can sign all our own free trade agreements, not even thinking about the quality of that trade agreement. Would a UK-China trade agreement be as deep as, say, an EU-China trade agreement? But that coalition cannot come up with an alternative of what life will be like outside the EU, because they can't agree. Because the left of that coalition will say, we'll leave and we'll nationalise everything and we won't have privatisation. The anti-immigrant bunch will say, yes, we'll close our borders and we'll let no one in. And then the globalists will say, no, we'll let everyone in, but it'll be a fairer system and we'll be able to trade with the rest of the world. They cannot advocate a coherent vision for what life outside the EU looks like. And at the end of the day, I'm not great at predicting it. Please don't put bets on this. But my gut feeling from just having gone around and talked to all the campaigns is that it may not be the strongest PR and the most positive PR, but the argument, better the devil you know, may well be the factor that wins the referendum for the Stay campaign. Thank you for allowing me to come here and close the conference, but thank you very much for being a beacon for what I hope other regions, including my own region, will copy in terms of making sure that we really discuss these ideas and activists and party members across the country do likewise. Thank you very much.